Well, a very good day to you all, and welcome to yet another episode of The Sound Perspective. And we are very honoured to have Lord Sewell here today, who is someone who has been an absolute pioneer, not just of the British Conservative movement, but a man who has dedicated many, many years of his work towards Britain's social cohesion, healing communities, and bringing this country together. And that's something we really need at the moment. Lord Sewell is a educational consultant. He is chair of the educational charity Generating Genius. He was also appointed after the 2020 protests to be chair of the Commission of the Race and Ethnic Disparities Commission, looking into racial disparity and social cohesion in this country. He sits as obviously as a peer in the House of Lords. He is also a CBE for his excellent work, and he has some really big and great conservative heroes that he looks up to, including the American conservative Thomas Sewell, if I pronounce that correctly. But Lord
Yeah.
Sewell, thank you for coming on the show. We really appreciate you having here. I'm also with my co-host here, Bruce Goodwin. Great to have you as well. But tell us a bit more about your background, also. What got you into this work, whether it be on the commission and your many other work in education too?
Well, thank you for having me. I mean, the thing is that what's driven me, I would say, towards looking at, I don't know, I suppose one could call it really, the dangerous word is activism, but I suppose it is a form of activism in a sense, is the fact that I do believe education in itself is still, and still is today, the greatest agency for social mobility to move yourself up. And that's come about mainly, I'm the product of Jamaican parentage that came here in the 1950s. I don't like that term, Windrush generation. I just prefer to call it a group of people who chanced it on the boat to come over here, really, in a sense. That was what was happening. Well, in my parents' case, on the plane, because there was, they came a bit later. And as technically kind of British citizens, given the context of the British Empire, they arrived here, and then from then on, I think they're part of a kind of sense that you use education to make yourself better. And we've seen that in many ethnic minority communities across the country.
Absolutely. Tell us a bit more about your work on the commission. And this is when,
Yeah.
you obviously your name obviously became even wider of recognition.
I mean,
Uh,
yeah. For people to sort of understand the context of where in 2011 we published this report, and 2 years prior to that we worked on it. Why did Boris Johnson choose me? Well, I had actually linked with him when he was mayor of London, and that I did another piece of work with Munira Mirza on just looking at how positive London was and how we could use industry and the private schools, etc., to kind of almost develop on the good work that London schools were doing. And we got a great fund called the London Excellence Fund, which was championed by Michael Gove. And I suppose out of that work that we did in London, when Boris became Prime Minister, he then thought, well, okay, or people around him as well advised him to say, well, look, let's go at this work in terms of a response to what was demonstrations in Britain, fueled by what was going on in America over here. And I think there was a sense that we had to respond to it. Now, what was interesting was the angle we took, and I think it was an important one, was to look at disparities and how they worked in Britain or didn't work for people. And I think for us, two things were significant. Number one was the composition of the commission itself, which was apart from one white guy, which in a sense, it was predominantly ethnic minority in that thing. And I was chair. And that was important. I don't think, it's ironic, strangely enough, most of the big commission, you think of Scarman, you think of all these other things, were headed by white blokes. But suddenly now we had the chance. So you would have thought, here we go again now. Here we have all these ethnic minorities. They're bound to sort of tell Britain how awful it is. And the outcome was completely different in a sense. And it wasn't through any ideological drive. It was simply what we did is we followed the data coming from the Office for National Statistics in particular. And interestingly, another part of the data, which people need to understand how this thing worked, was there was an organization, or an entity, a unit called the Race Disparity Unit, set up by Theresa May. And in fact, so that unit in itself, which was gathering data on race and things like that, and the racial disparities, it seemed to me was very dormant because it didn't come out and tell us really what the true story was. And I think in a sense, one of the things that made this thing explosive was I can give you the actual page number, because people don't read these reports, believe me or not. I'm talking about reports that nobody would ever read. But page 37, the middle of the paragraph, I can tell you exactly where it is. And it was the section that talked about white underachievement, actually, and it was also about geography and ethnicity. And so really we were concluded that these outcomes were complex. They were driven, racial disparities in Britain were not really predominantly about racism. And that was a bombshell. And in fact, ethnic minority groups were doing predominantly, apart from a few groups, particularly Gypsy Roma, were actually doing very well, better than the white groups were. And that in fact, the real crisis that we were facing was actually white British poor people. That was the group that were under all the numbers. And I think the worst number was, I'm sorry, I've got two white blokes in front of me, and the chances are that you're not going to live as long as an African woman. That is so what we've got. Well, you're rich white people, so you don't count. But certainly poor white folks, particularly in the north of England, and particularly from poor communities, their life expectancy was lower. It's on the lowest on the range. Now you imagine everybody drunk on the elixir of George Floyd. We come out in 2011 with that number, and everybody went mad.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's that fantastic Telegraph article that came out recently saying how, you were saying how Star and Angela Rayner taking the knee was just absolute disaster. And you talk about the disparities of, for example, white working class communities. Do you feel Labour has permanently cut themselves off from that traditional voter base?
Let me go further, and I'll be very careful what I say here. It wasn't just Labour, in fact, and this is in a sense, we can talk, we're all now friends here, because we can now see the gap that's gone on in conservatism now, whereas before we were hiding. Sure. And let's be honest, there were certain groups of conservative people who didn't want this either, and
absolutely,
and had doubts about it.
So do you sense, as with a lot of things these days, that it's literally lazy heuristics, intellectuals finding a mental shortcut to attribute, towards disparities, rather than actually, as you say, doing the deep drill down into the causes. So I feel that this is something you see a lot these days, whatever the subject, immigration, net zero, racism, institutional racism, is that it is just so very easy to use heuristics rather than,
I think what also happened,
deep dive.
Yeah, you're right. And I think that what happened also was that a lot of people said, and people come to me and said, Tony, I don't care about these data. I don't care about the numbers. It's about how I feel, so my feelings, and I don't feel,
yes.
I don't feel I've been lost. I don't feel. Now, in a way, we can sit here and say that well, we can rubbish. The report didn't even rubbish it. It did take consideration into that. And I do believe that people do have legitimate kind of feelings about this situation, individual. But when you're going to sort of taint a nation and taint a people around a kind of almost like a part of this kind of systemic kind of hold that says most I mean, two things happening here: that the people are guilty of this, and that and we're talking about white people specifically here, and that in fact white people and the black and ethnic minority population are actually victims. And so you almost get a religious response.
Yeah. Well, this is what Professor Kaufman talks about in his book Taboo, where he discusses the what he calls the sacralization of these historically marginalized groups, and yeah, that I think that is what is behind. He talks about this being a more liberal overreach rather than a political agenda. Although I suspect, tell me your opinion, but it is probably both, because I remember some of your detractors after the report came out calling it a divisive polemic. And which I think was an accusation that could easily have been, pointed at themselves. But how much? I mean, it came out at a very politically charged time as well.
So people were. It's really interesting, and you can be. It showed me how, in a sense, people can be prisoners of their time or what actually happens in the moment almost. So they're almost caught up in it. And so for example, the Rainer Starmer bending the knee thing, it was almost, if you'd asked them that, I think both of them are embarrassed by that. And a lot of people looking back now have got kind of hidden and got into corners that they shouldn't have. I'll give you one example of it, and it's the corporate sector that went into, and we're a relatively well-funded charity. I'm talking about charity generating genius, but there were one or two corporates who decided to. I mean, it was the group inside that a lot of these corporates have. Some of them are very good, some of them are not. What I would call diversity inclusion groups, predominantly led by minorities. And at that time, it's really, I can go back a long way, and sometimes the corporate would ignore these groups. Suddenly, it's like a sustainability thing. Suddenly, they're brought up to be important. And then when the economy is working, they're shoved back again into the margins, And so it's the way in which these groups work. And one of those groups were, I mean, I'll name them now. It was Sony PlayStation. Now you imagine black students at that point, because the charity I ran was focusing on that group in particular. We go for everybody now, but it was quite clear that in the sector of gaming, and if you look at all those kind of games that are around and the production of them, it was predominantly, I would say, 95% white males were in that production area. It's just I don't have any problems with that, but that's what it was. So Sony wanted to change the demographic around that. They came to us because we knew where to go to get those students to help them with that story. And then but I was warned that if I didn't find institutional racism in my report, this was before we wrote it, there would be trouble. But make sure there was a kind of health warning on this. And then in the end, we signed a deal. It was a lot of money for over a number of years. We would have brought a lot of those kids into that industry. When the report came out, they walked away and took and it wasn't so. I don't think the people who run Sony PlayStation knew that this was going on. I just think they just parked that in their area and they do their thing. And of course, because it's an employee group, in a sense, you're driven by what they say. and the person who ran it, one person who ran it, he's not working for them. None of those groups work for PlayStation anymore. They all left. I checked. They all left. So and so therefore we were punished, and this is where it gets kind of interesting: punished or cancelled for having a report that simply said that that the outcomes of disparity are complex. We've got to think about geography, and we've got to think about poor white people living in the north and in the south coast. And institutional racism is in effect we didn't even mention really institutional. Wasn't the key driver of this. It was more complicated. That's all we said in this review. And we will and he said, so here's the irony. You take away the money from who? It was all these black children who could have who could today be working for PlayStation. You see what I mean? And that's how kind of warped the logic is in.
Absolutely. And also I'd love to talk to you about what is many consider as called woke capitalism, EDI, DEI. A lot of people today, you mentioned about white working class, feel that there is a complete, there's a disparity at the moment when applying for jobs, where affirmative action means that certain companies have quotas. I'd love to discuss with you the legality of that, and especially essentially what is called quote positive discrimination, and how many larger corporations, especially corporations that aspire to be B corporations, where they're essentially, if they pass a DEI check, they can be called at that level. Is this kind of a dangerous path we're going down?
Let me tell you about this, because I actually don't think that it's a sin to think about fairness in the workplace. I do think that that's okay. What drives a lot of the I think there's a hierarchy. Those who run the company, these big corporations and companies, they feel nervous a lot of the time. They don't want to be called out. They don't want to be exposed. And they're particularly nervous about race. I mean, actually, I think that's now less now. The trans thing is more up there now than it was before. But race was always continually this. And so anything that got them out of jail, or any amount of money to just do your Black History Month, just so we can go and we can just write on our report, our annual report, that we did this. Now, look, I think what's happened is there are lots of companies that are not that cynical, and I know them and I work with them, and they're great companies. They will not go down that cynical route, because the leadership in the company say, look, we want to take this thing seriously, and we want to know where it's going to make be most effective. So, for example, the ethnicity pay gap, which we argued in the report, in a sense, is so complex that it will only be a tick box exercise. It will never, because you can't get to this. You cannot make it comparable to the gender thing. It just doesn't work. You have you say, for example, you have a company in Cornwall somewhere, right? And then you're going to have, and there might be one black person in that. I mean, how are you going to do their pay against 90% of the company? Because it's the geography that's made them. They haven't to do with racism. It's just that there's just not enough black people. Or, for example, in the construction industry, where there are not many black people working in there. So
I think Thomas Sewell, he has he loves to use empirical evidence, and one of the things I remember him saying was that US companies who did criminal background checks actually employed more young black men than those that were forced to stop doing it on the grounds of discrimination. And I think that this goes back to, I do think that sort of liberals get themselves in a bit of a tangle sometimes. If you take the sort of Martin Luther King view of the world, that we should all be equal under the law, which is the liberal philosophy, but then you start deliberately discriminating affirmative action and so on. you end up with outcomes that you didn't intend. You cause resentments elsewhere. You cause division that possibly wasn't there before.
Yeah.
And I think you highlighted in another interview that I saw that we don't talk about the progress that was made. So you and I are at the same age, and you've clearly out achieved me. So it's, the point I was going to make was that I feel like that during my younger days, the 60s to the 90s, a huge amount of progress was made. But once we got into after the turn of the century, we had codification of a lot of these, rather than the society leading politics got deeply involved and started to codify a lot of stuff. And that's where the division has started, actually.
Yeah, and I think you're right. So, for example, one of the things that and hopefully here you're talking about a list of achievements. I hope people will go out and buy my book, Black Success: The Surprising Truth. Because in there, what I do, and it's really a story about what you're saying here, is that the way in which those codes work is that they are meant to unravel really a kind of deep-seated kind of and take people into a direction where you're not really going after the real reasons. So, for example, in my book, I'm looking at success, and it's quite kind of I'd say it's a very smart way of doing the thing. Where I was saying that there are black success that I'm charting has nothing to do with being black or race at all. Is there other factors? I'll give you one example. Hackney education, which is really one of the interesting stories in the 90s. Prior to my involvement, and I didn't do it myself, but a group of us, it was deemed the worst education authority, not only in the UK, but in Europe. Yeah, it had that kind of wider. And it was awful. I mean, there was nobody wanted to go near that place, and and the outcomes for children, not only in terms of the education outcomes, but exclusions and things like that. And the group again that was suffering the worst at that time, funny enough, in that borough were African Caribbean students. I mean, today it would be the equivalent would be white boys, but I mean, in Hackney that was the population, and what's interesting about the response to that was they used all these kinds of interventions that were all race specific around that group, and it didn't work. So, for example, they called for black teachers because they thought, well, that would be the answer for those kids. That didn't work. Called for the curriculum to be changed to make it more black, whatever. That didn't work. They wanted to ban exclusion. So they tried every single thing around that race drive. When we got in, and the government, it was a Labour government, who asked us to intervene, and myself, I came in the group of Alan Wood and Mike Wilson were the key players in there. And what we did is, I remember the group of us sitting around, and we got a 10-year contract for the government to say, please, for God's sake, solve this problem. Yeah, that was basically the paper that was left. We'll give you a lot of money for this, but solve this because we don't know what we're doing here. And we did nothing at all to do with race. And what we did was we really went for the general things around achievement, the behavior around the behavior issues. The key one was leadership. I spent a lot of my time in meetings firing head teachers, or at least agreeing gently that you should move on. And they were happy to take the redundancy, you know what I mean? So we cleaned out and found really good head teachers from across the country. And we built these, what would be now the academy movement that you now have as the norm. It really got started there. And I look back now on that time. What changed was the results of African Caribbean students went through the roof. after 2 years. Hackney then became not only moved from being like the worst borough to being one of the highest achieving boroughs in the country.
Yeah.
And nothing to do with race at all.
I love, yeah.
And so you have a whole industry of academics, of groups, of charities, of organizations, all driving at this same thing. I mean, there was a fund called the Ethnic Minority Achievement Fund, millions of pounds being poured in to fix the race problem of these children, and had nothing to do with race. Basically, we said, get to school on time, have a great leader in your school, behave yourself.
And absolutely. And I'd love to ask what you think of obviously the head teacher of the Michaela School, Catherine Burbassing, who said that she sees that as a real model school. She says that multiculturalism needs to be managed, and it does work, and it works through her system of education. Some people are saying that, including Tony Blair at one point, saying multiculturalism has failed. What's your view?
First of all, I was involved in the setting up of that school right in the early days. And I think it's really a quasi-religious school. If you look at all the format, it's a secular religion. Can you have those contradictions? It's a secular religious, because it's driven by sacrifice. Children have to sacrifice themselves, not in that horrible sense, but in that giving sense, which is unheard of in the way you want. And it's also discipline as well, and great leadership. But the concept of multiculturalism, I think, is something that look. What really it is about in the end, I think, is children being able to kind of feel a sense of belonging to their country and belonging to their team, and I think that's the heart of it. And so you cannot have something that is just totally dependent on ratcheting up the differences, ethnic differences. You got to have something that everybody piles in, they feel they belong to, And I think that's the key. That's the key kind of thing that makes it happen for me. So if you have a school, I think schools are quite important in this sense. That's where you begin this sort of notion that we're in this together, we belong to the same thing. Not, I'm here to celebrate this group. No. And the other thing I think now, and it's something that I've been thinking about of writing a new book after everyone's got out and bought Black Success, and that's run out. The next book has been, I think, is why I feel proud to be British. I mean, that's one of the titles I want to write about. And in that book, what I want to do is particularly give young people a real sense of the other story. At the moment, if you go into some of our schools and you are faced with the history curriculum or the English curriculum or anything else, as a British-born kid, you feel ashamed to be British. You see, everything is about atrocity, about slavery, but what about all the great things that Britain has contributed to the world? And why aren't we teaching our kids about that? It's not propaganda. It's just what is really out there.
What are your views on when the post-Empire situation where we had the British Commonwealth, which was a great support from the late Queen, and that I think was intended to bring people together, whereas now it's being touted as an extension of
mechanism for reparation,
part of the problem, and so on.
And look, this is where you hit a good point here. What it is it needs. People have just got to be bolder now and stop being such, sort of rowing back on what you're good at. So the King, for example, I really hope that he takes on this issue of saying, look, here is what we've look in the area of health, in the area of civics, if you look at the way in which most countries, of those Commonwealth countries, they will tell you, not divided in a sense, but held together by what we would call the British sort of way of working, the parliamentary system, the legal system, the schooling system. It's all come from Britain. I mean, you play around here. But I mean, Singapore, Jamaica, we could go across the Commonwealth. We find that it's held together by British. If you and I now got up and said that, people would say that we're being chauvinist or we're being racist, and we shouldn't talk about those things.
Yeah, I remember. I think it was the Oxford Union speech you gave, where you gave this personal anecdote of your grandparents when you used to receive letters from them, and it was written in perfect handwriting, perfect grammar, and so on. And they were very humble people, but they had acquired a colonial education that was available to obviously, the British elite, and they had acquired that.
You just
that's that aspiration thing, because I would use another example where the working class in this country, when they had the choice between a Russian-style revolution, communism, and participating in democracy and capitalism, they chose the latter. And the suffragettes, they just wanted a piece of the action. They aspired to be, and that was the sort of message I got from what you said then.
Look, you see, it's quite interesting, what Britain has given to the world, not only on the sort of, and to America as well, because that system is also built on British inheritance. Not only on the structures and the stabilities of societies, but also on the way in which we can kick ass as well. It's the two things. We're great. I mean, no other country, I would say this and people laugh at me, there's no other place on the planet that punk rock could have been invented but in England. You know what I mean? We have the two things run together. I have no difficulty when people say, what is British values? And then everybody gets stuck. It's quite obvious what they are. It's about stability. It's about tradition. It's about going right the way back to Magna Carta. It's giving all these stable things that people use. And at the same time, we're a bunch of, we're really good at rebelling as well. And so the two things run together in the society, and people have used those traditions, suffragettes, things like that, to inform their own way in which they work. Admittedly, we've called on, and the US have inherited some of this as well. The civil rights movement has come in, and that's been stuff that's come out of America. So that's informed the world as well. But what we've forgotten to keep telling the world is how in fact we've been so influential. It's funny, because one particular Guardian journalist criticized me for being kind of, they keep saying denying racism. She keeps saying, and one of the things she said, and she's an advocate of the whole Windrush thing. And she said that when she was taking all the stories of the people who have been ripped off through Windrush, she was sad to hear their names. Winston, these are Jamaicans, who are Winston, Edward, we keep going, George, I mean, these are typical, a lot of these are typical Jamaican names. But the reason why, it wasn't that they had a colonial mentality using these names, as which she was implying. It was that, in fact, you would name your son like the same name as the king, because you thought that's a tradition that people do. You want your son to be, George, and then and Henry, and so Jamaicans have those names, not because they're sort of running around feeling colonial, but because they wanted to link to what was regarded as the best thing in town, and I mean, now they wouldn't do it. They'd probably call everybody Usain, because but things move on.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you understand, so there's a real sense here that she's and you said about the liberal mentality completely missed the boat. They don't get it. They just don't understand because they're ashamed of themselves. And that's the thing. And they want our children, particularly white children in England, to feel ashamed of themselves as well. That's the problem we've got here.
And it feels
Yes,
like,
and
say, a
yeah, go on.
metropolitan liberal establishment that is overwhelmingly educated at Oxbridge, privately educated, who, we see in private schools, even headmasters who are promoting this kind of almost this white guilt, this notion that we are literally criminals. Even instead of following the kind of, like you say, the kind of healthy social cohesion and that model that it's so important to follow. But I just wanted to very quickly just ask you, and we've seen the most horrific scenes in the last few weeks with the riots. It's what's happened in this country has just been tragic. After the terrible murder of those three children, we have seen the most awful violence, hatred. How does this country heal?
Well, I mean, it heals really. I mean, I think Catherine with her school, Michaela, and what we did in Hackney, we need to go back to looking at those, particularly, I think in education, I really do think, and Martin Oliver, the current head of Ofsted, who was on my commission report, he was part of one of the commissioners. I mean, he worked in schools that prior to that were in some of those areas that were involved in a rioting. Now, look, let me get one thing clear. I think that we've got to be very careful about, and I call it like letting the fox inside the chicken coop, really, in a sense that there are definitely agents who are taking advantage of this.
Yes.
And you can see it. Let's not be naive here. However, as you can see, the report came out long before these riots and warned the country that we should be really moving towards. I gave an analogy of this. I said that I don't even remember the last Olympics, in London Olympics. And I said, what happens there is we're all together and we're all cheering and we're all together for Britain. And then what happens when we leave? And do we come together or do we separate? And I do think that for me, what we're not doing enough is listening to those communities. And I think particularly the Red Wall ones, who have been used and abused by both parties, really. And I think for me, I think the answer is improve. I think the leveling up agenda for those people wasn't necessarily about housing alone. Housing is important. I think the leveling up agenda worked in London in a different way. We improved the schools. What happened was that once the primary schools and secondary schools were improved in Hackney, suddenly the middle class piled in. They wanted to come in and have some of the action. And to a certain extent, the areas were gentrified. But at the same time, it was the brand Hackney got improved. I do think that similar sort of process of improving schools in those areas is the strategy that Starmer should be taking now. Yes, condemn the people who did all those racist violence, but at the same time, I think there's nothing wrong in saying I get it now. And what we should be doing is improving those schools in those areas. I suspect they won't go down that route at all because it's too hard. I think they find that project too hard.
They tend towards this idea that of equality of outcome, and I think that always produces what you might term as leveling down, and which doesn't solve the problems. And it is about aspiration and so on. I wondered if
Bruce, is that also this term equity? Is that linked with this notion of you've got to go further than equality?
Yes, but I think that also, as I think Lord Sewell, you pointed out before, tends towards identifying the wrong problem and then pursuing the wrong solution.
That's
Um,
right.
and I wondered if I might just introduce at this point, because reading your book, you know, the success of the Windrush, um, the Windrush
Yeah.
immigrants. It reminded me both of a personal anecdote and another comparison, which may be very useful, and that is that you know, my father-in-law, who grew up in Indiana, he worked two jobs. This was in the 60s. He worked two jobs to get himself to college, and became a radiation biologist, and was very well regarded by his peer group. Did very, very well. And you know, he has no time for what you might call the people who won't go through that door, you know, into participation. Um, and it goes back to you spoke about the civil rights legislation, which was absolutely necessary. But prior to that, in the US, you had this great migration from the southern states where segregation, Jim Crow still existed, and they went to the north. And although there was discrimination there of a sort, um, the black communities there prospered. They did very well for themselves. They were able to set up businesses. They were predominantly nuclear families who went to church at the weekends. And this was all happening before the civil rights legislation of the 60s occurred. Um, and similarly, you know, the success of your Windrush generation, that all happened before the legislation that we took on board in the noughties. So there's a much bigger sample, I think, that you could point to prove your case.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And I think the other thing is that when you think of Windrush now, you keep thinking of the scandal. You don't think of really what drove that group. And it was really around, funny if it was around housing and how they really did well in the sense. And it's not that you want suffering to hit you, but if the circumstances are there, what ironically happened was they couldn't get rented accommodation. So in the end, they decided to buy their own properties, and I'm a beneficiary of that in the sense of the inheritance. But certainly, that then made them one of the highest property owners. You know, in that people don't talk about that story, don't understand that. They also drove their own informal banking system. You know, they were lending to each other, and there was an interest on that loan because they couldn't get loans from banks. So the adversity, ironically, led to some of these their own sort of institutional kind of, you know, kind of ability to kind of be very resilient and actually go forward. What probably did happen was what happened to their children, because you see that was the big project, and I am part of that. And I look back now and I think that there was an education system that wasn't working, and I think that it wasn't work. But the thing is, it wasn't working for everybody, in the sense of white working class as well. And I think that was the big kind of problem, as well as the police. And I think there were real issues there, and over racism that was still going on. But what, as you said, wasn't acknowledged was, and hasn't been acknowledged, is by the time you come round to even the mid 1990s, the country had changed completely from what it was in the 70s, you know. And you hear people talking about Britain now as if we were living in the 1960s, you know, or even then. You know. And it's a completely different. And here is the strange thing that the report did was, if you are technically at this point, and this is where I think the resentment and the disparity happens, but it's a factor. It's not actually Caribbean background; it's usually African background now, because I see it with my own charity. That if you're a black male or female, really, in a school in London, in an academy, you are going to do much better. You're more likely to go to a top university. You're more likely to, in the end, eventually get. I mean, there are issues about employment, but if you get a top degree, especially in science, you're going to get a job. Your profile, your trajectory is far better than somebody in Knowsley in Liverpool, just outside of Liverpool, their projections are zero. Their projections is straight to the dole queue. And I think that, so, we have this geographical disparity. It's really not about race, it's about geography. And I think that London has dominated the whole scene, particularly educationally, and left everybody behind. And I think that is going back to your question about what was behind those riots, in a sense, was indeed that. I mean, it was a protest. I think part of that was a protest. And I think that we've got to look at that. But as well as that, we've got to do two things at the same time. We've got to be careful of the fox, in a sense, which is, these groups that can come in and really cause mayhem. At the same time, you've got to listen to what the government, the government have got to listen. They've got to listen to what that group is saying. And I worry that what this will be is, and this is my biggest worry, will be a doubling up of the identity politics. Because what people will come and say, here are these group of the white unwashed mass, and what they need is a good dose of anti-racism, and that will cure them. And so you'll have more of that stuff going into schools, going to universities, and we will miss the point that what they do need is to be told how great Britain is, in their classrooms and in their schools, not be ashamed of being British.
Yeah. And on that note, Lord Sewell, in this time of uncertainty and of the future, that's a glimmer of hope, and we really hope that your findings, your work, your convictions are not just listened to but action, because we really need your work right now. Never has it become at a better time. So thank you so much for coming on The Sound Perspective. Do like and subscribe. We really hope to have you on again in person, of course, as well as your book as well, which we are very keen to obviously see more of. Bruce, thank you for co-hosting, and we look forward to seeing you on the
Thank you to Lord Sewell.
Thank you, Lord.
Many more questions left for us to explore, I believe.
Absolutely, we'll be here for hours.
Thank you.
But I think we talked about the important cruxes, but thank you very much.
Have a good day.